Welcome to UnityFirst.com. I am your host, Janine Fondon, and I will be joined by Dani Monroe. Dani is the CEO of Center Focus International, as well as the convener of the Martha's Vineyard CDO Summit. She's releasing the new report, From the Inside Out. Let's hear it from Dani. Well, welcome, Dani. Welcome to UnityFirst.com. We are always excited to hear from you on these very important issues that relate to DEI. So you have the report that's being released. Tell us a little bit about the report and what it should mean to all of us.
So, Janine, thank you for having me this morning. I always look forward to chatting with you on diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. The significance of this report is that we are looking at the role of the Chief Diversity Officer sort of from behind the curtains for the first time, and really examining what happens with Chief Diversity Officers on a daily basis. And that it also is important because this particular study took a position of examining the role from an asset model versus a deficit model. So oftentimes when information is out there on chief diversity officers or DE&I, it's all about what's broken and not enough resources, doesn't report to the CEO, et cetera, et cetera. And I knew any number of chief diversity officers was having tremendous impact in their organizations, but that story was never getting told. So it's like, I wanted to provide a new perspective and an addition to the narrative and to the story so that it wasn't one-dimensional. From the deficit model perspective, we are an asset. Chief diversity officers are an asset to their organization.
So tell me, what are the findings that you can share and that you really want us to absorb?
Yeah, I think one of the findings really is to understand that chief diversity officers are an asset to their organization.
The CDOs today stand on the shoulders of many voices who came before. In 1968, Dr. Price Cobbs, who published Black Rage with Dr. William Greer to highlight Black life in the United States. In 1984, Roosevelt Thomas founded the American Institute for Managing Diversity. In 1997, Lawrence Otis Graham publishes Proversity, Getting Past the Face Value and Finding the Soul of People. In 2000, Elsie Cross published Managing Diversity, The Courage to Lead. And in 2003, Price Cobbs and Judith Turnoff published Cracking the Corporate Code, the revealing success stories of 32 African American executives. Today, in 2024, Dani explains that the CDO roles have changed and been expanded. So tell me, what are the findings that you can share and that you really want us to absorb?
Yeah, I think one of the findings really is to understand that chief diversity officers are an asset to their organization, right? And that they have incredible value. They work across the organization, right? Unlike any other executive level role, the CDO has to be able to build bridges and do interventions across the organization and understand the broad organization. They are often called into a myriad of meetings that perhaps from the outside doesn't look like DE&I is related to it, but it often is. So the expansion of this role has been tremendous, especially over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of depth and breadth of the role. And at the same time, they're not valued often in the same way that other C-suite executives are valued.
Since the death of George Floyd in 2020, with subsequent presidential executive orders and Supreme Court decisions, the trends in many companies find CDOs facing tough headwinds, as Dani explains.
Yeah, I think folks are confused at the moment about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, as you know, Janine, it is under attack. And I do believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion has been successful, or we would not be seeing this attack that is happening today. And so I think that some fear got raised in people of privilege across the board, and some not even of privilege, right? But what we saw after George Floyd was an incredible increase of chief diversity officers in organization as America did a knee-jerk reaction to what happened with George Floyd. And many organizations jumped on the bandwagon and said, we're going to hire a chief diversity officer, thinking as if like that was the solution. And it wasn't the solution. Oftentimes they were hiring chief diversity officers who didn't have the subject matter expertise, may have been business leaders in other ways in the organization, and the organization wasn't ready to do the work that's necessary for DE&I and lay the foundation. And when the work began to get very complex, right, some of them began to say, I didn't realize that I signed up for this. I thought it was something else. And then we come into the era that we're in now with the Supreme Court decision last summer with affirmative action in higher ed. And that began to give a license for folks who were sitting on the fence to really just get off the fence, right? And go to the other side and really go silent or move this around so it was more acceptable, to size the departments, to restructure it so it wasn't in as an important position, right? But flip side, many organizations doubled down on DE&I and said, hey, we are not backing up. Jamie Dimon Morgan, JP Morgan is one person who said, hey, we're sticking with our diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts because it makes good business sense. There are other organizations who just very quietly have continued and increased budgets and staff and et cetera, but you're not hearing that in the news. See, what we're hearing again is the deficit negative narrative about how things are broken. And, part of my reason for doing this report is to begin to bring a little balance to that narrative and say this work, when done well, as Mark Kuhlman said, from Shark Tank, he said, diversity is a good business strategy, and any business strategy, if it's not implemented well, is not going to be effective. It has nothing to do that it's DE&I. It has to do whether or not it's being implemented effectively as a business strategy.
The report shows that CDOs are truly making an impact. And this is the narrative we hope to share.
Yeah, I think a big part is people don't understand the role. There's a lot of invisibility to the role. It is not like you're a chief financial officer or the technology officer or even the human resource officer. I mean, you work from different perspectives and different strengths and different skills. I mean, in my own role, I actually help design inclusive health centers, right? So how would you think a CDO would be involved in actually the design of a building? Or most recently, CDOs were called to navigate the geopolitical dynamics and fallout of the Israeli-Hamas war. We're not trained in that. The best people in the world aren't trained in geopolitical issues, but we were expected somehow to navigate that and do it in a way that pleased everyone. when it was an incredible, almost impossible task to really represent all sides of that conversation without somebody being angry. But oftentimes CEOs and other C-suite executives, they went silent and turned that work over to the CDO. And as opposed to as executive leaders really picking up some of that charge. And the CEO should have been leading that conversation. The C-suite should have been leading those conversations. And yet oftentimes it was just the CDO who was navigating the aftermath in their organizations around that particular geopolitical issue. People don't often, again, think about the CDO role being as expansive. They often think about it sitting in human resources, right? When many CDOs no longer sit in human resources because some organizations do understand that it's more effective outside of human resources. How CDOs came into the role is one of the findings, that there isn't a straight path. There are four different possibilities to come into this role. And so we explored those four possibilities and the skills and responsibilities and capabilities needed to actually do this role successfully. We've defined impact. I mean, oftentimes, people don't think about how do they have impact in an organization, right? Folks go about doing their work, but do they ever step back and say, wow, have I really had impact in this organization? And, we defined impact that had really four different categories of impact. The individual and interpersonal impact, which is sort of like the conversations between people or teams, et cetera. Organizational impact, how are you facilitating large change across your organization? The business impact, which is critical because DE&I is tied to the business of an organization, and this is also what makes the role so valuable today. And then finally, societal impact. Today, with many organizations being involved in their communities, supporting their communities, let's say around healthcare disparities, et cetera, or equity in financial health, that societal impact is a big part of the role. So when a CDO has to think about how they navigate impact over those four categories, that is a huge job to do and do it well. And tying this to, the business is critical. I remember one CDO, when I was reading through this, said something like, and I'll paraphrase, people think that diversity, equity, and inclusion is fuzzy, but it really isn't. It really is about the business of the organization. I've seen the impact, the positive impact of DE&I, and I'm not talking about just hiring diverse people. I'm talking about all aspects of an organization and the organization's bottom line, right? One CDO shared with me that last year sometime he brought in a $500 million project to his organization, and the only reason why the client decided to go with them was because he was sitting at the table and the client told them that. And but we don't hear those stories. We don't know Lululemon, and their former founder, right? Now he's making billions of dollars off of his shares in Lululemon, and they have a diversity strategy. And I would ask, what percentage of his revenue is coming from that diverse market? And so those are the things you have to begin to ask that no one's asking about how DE&I makes a difference.
The CDO report also mentions that moving forward with this work means that we have to have a shared ownership of DEI and involve a broad set of stakeholders.
But, I think one of the things where we have in some ways not been as effective as leaders of this work is to, especially in the last number of years where we really began to focus on race as a major component of the work, is I think we left some people behind. So that we need to have more voices in this conversation, different voices, so people see themselves in this work, and that we don't set up us versus them scenario, because I think that began to happen coming out of George Floyd work, and I understand, why, but I don't think it. After a while, people began to get race fatigue. Right. And it was like, oh, we talked about this for 2 years. Can we move on to something else? Well, this has been going on for 400 years. And so talking about it for 2 years is not the answer. But what we could have done, I think, more successfully is to really help folks understand, not only what their part is and sort of the dynamics of equity, but also how they get impacted no matter who they are as an individual, whether they're white, whether they're older, whether they're a person with abilities or not, whether they are a senior executive in an organization, right? I remember oftentimes with senior executives when I was a consultant, they would say to me, I really didn't get this until my daughter came home and started talking about what she was going through at work. And then I started to understand how this is impacting everyone. And so our ability to reach out and hear all sides of a conversation, all different viewpoints. And I know there is this sense now of sort of oppression, competition, right? And so who's more oppressed, blacks or women or people LGBTQ. And one of the things, I do get that concept, but one of the things I'm extremely familiar with, because I have a human development background, is that human pain is human pain. Mm-hmm. And when it's inflicted upon people, you go through the same psychological and physical experience. And if we can remember that, I think that helps Janine to begin to, make it easier for folks to get engaged and navigate the historical piece. So I think one of the last things to talk about is that the chief diversity officers, they often are impacted by this work because they experience the same microaggressions as anybody else in the organization, but they have to almost rise above that in order to do their job. So that's a great emotional toll on them. But they are doing that work with great resilience and resolve, understanding what the end benefit is about. But there is a certain level of burnout that happens in this role as a result of that. And yet we are finding people who stand up every day and take the charge of leading their organization through an incredibly important change process.
Thank you, Dani Monroe, for sharing this wonderful report with us. And I hope all of our listeners will see that the new research indicates that chief diversity officers are needed now more than ever, and they are doing even more under a lot of stress and all sorts of elements that make their work difficult. But they are trying to really bring their best to the table for all. Get the report. See the link.